The psychology of suggestion, how to make ideas feel like their own. You have never had a fully original thought. That sentence sounds like an insult. It isn't one, it's a description of how a human mind actually works. Every idea you have ever come up with was assembled from fragments, things you read, conversations you half remembered, images you saw once and forgot you saw, a stray comment from a coworker 11 months ago that resurfaced last Tuesday wearing the disguise of a gut feeling. Your mind is not a factory that manufactures thoughts from nothing. It is a curator, arranging material that arrived from somewhere else, and then, this is the important part, erasing the receipt. That erasure is not a bug. It is the exact mechanism this book is about. Suggestion is the art and science of placing an idea into someone's mind in a way that survives the erasure, so that by the time they act on it, it doesn't feel borrowed. It feels native. It feels like them. I want to be precise about what this book is and isn't, because the subject invites suspicion, and the suspicion is often warranted. This is not a manual for tricking people into things that harm them. It is not a collection of dark psychology party tricks designed to make you feel powerful at dinner. It is something slower and, I think, more useful, an attempt to make visible a mechanism that is already running, constantly, underneath every conversation, advertisement, negotiation, parenting decision, therapy session, and relationship you are part of, whether or not anyone involved understands it. Here is the claim the whole book rests on. Right now, today, ideas are being placed into your mind by people who understand this mechanism and by systems that were optimized for it by trial and error, long before anyone wrote a psychology paper about why they worked. Advertisers, political strategists, skilled negotiators, and yes, some manipulative individuals in your own life, are already using every technique in the chapters that follow. You are already the target. The only question this book actually answers is whether you go on being a target who cannot see the mechanism, or become someone who can see it clearly enough to defend against it, and, when your intentions are good, use it to help other people find their own clarity faster than they could have found it alone. That last clause matters more than it might seem to on a first read. Every technique described here is ethically neutral, in the same way a lever is ethically neutral. A lever can lift a trapped person out of rubble or pry open a locked door that wasn't yours to open. The techniques don't carry morality inside them. Chapter 14 is devoted entirely to where that morality has to come from, and I'd encourage you not to skip it, whatever order you read the rest of the book in. 15 chapters. One mechanism, examined from every angle it has, the biology underneath it, the specific linguistic and behavioral techniques that exploit it, worked examples that show the machinery running in real time, and finally, the ethical scaffolding that has to surround all of it before any of it is safe to use on another human being. Chapter 1. The Invisible Hand, Why We Think Our Ideas Are Truly Our Own. Ask someone why they bought the car they drive, chose the career they chose, or believe the political position they hold, and they will give you a reason. It will sound complete. It will sound like it was arrived at through careful, independent reasoning, weighed and considered like a judge examining evidence. It almost never was. Psychologists call this the introspection illusion, the confident but mistaken belief that we have direct, reliable access to the causes of our own thoughts and behavior. In reality, we are extraordinarily good at generating plausible explanations after the fact, and extraordinarily bad at knowing whether those explanations are actually true. The explanation-generating machinery in your brain does not pause to check its work against the historical record. It simply produces something coherent, hands it to your conscious mind, and your conscious mind accepts it the way you'd accept a receipt from a cashier you trust, without auditing the till. In a well-known line of research conducted by Peter Johansson and Lars Hall, people were shown pairs of photographs of faces and asked to choose which face they found more attractive, then asked to explain their choice. Unknown to the participants, the experimenters occasionally used a sleight of hand card trick to swap the photograph after the choice was made, handing the person the face they had actually rejected, and the majority of participants failed to notice the switch. They went on to confidently, fluently explain why they preferred a face they had, moments earlier, turned down. Their explanations referenced hair, eye color, a sense of warmth in the expression, details that were often more true of the rejected photo than the one they'd actually chosen. The reasoning wasn't fake in the sense of being consciously invented to deceive the researcher. It was genuinely, sincerely generated. It was simply generated to justify a conclusion the person's actual selection process never reached. If we can't reliably detect a swapped photograph in our own hands, seconds after making the choice, we are certainly not going to detect a swapped idea in our own heads, weeks after someone planted it in a conversation we've mostly forgotten. This is the opening the entire discipline of suggestion depends on. Not deception in the cartoonish sense, not lying, not coercion, not hypnotic mind control lifted from a movie plot, but a simple, well-documented, replicated gap between where an idea originates and where the mind files it as having originated. Close that gap in someone's favor, or, if you're the one being suggested to, notice when someone else is closing it in theirs, and you don't need to win an argument. There's no argument to win. The idea already lives there, wearing their name, filed under things I've always sort of thought. Why the gap exists in the first place. It helps to understand that this isn't a design flaw so much as a trade-off your brain made under evolutionary pressure. Tracking the precise origin of every piece of information you've ever encountered, every fact, every impression, every half-formed opinion, would require an enormous amount of ongoing cognitive bookkeeping. Evolution does not reward organisms that spend metabolic energy on bookkeeping with no immediate survival payoff. It rewards organisms that make fast, usually good enough decisions cheaply. Source memory, the specific memory of where you learned something, as opposed to the fact itself, is one of the first things to degrade under time, stress, or divided attention, precisely because the brain treats it as a lower priority than the content itself. This is why you can often remember a fact with total confidence while being completely unable to say where you learned it. You just know that a certain diet is unhealthy, that a certain historical figure was cruel, that a certain investment strategy is smart, and if pressed, you'll construct a source. I think I read a study about it, that may or may not be accurate, because your brain would rather generate a plausible answer than admit it doesn't actually know. A brief case study. Consider a mundane, low-stakes version of this that almost everyone has lived through. A friend mentions, in passing, during an unrelated conversation, that a certain neighborhood is up and coming. 3 months later, you find yourself telling a different friend that you've been thinking about that neighborhood, that it feels like a smart bet, that you have a good feeling about it. You are not lying. You have, genuinely, been thinking about it. What you've lost, completely, without any sense of loss, is the fact that the thought didn't originate with you. It originated with a sentence someone else said, in a context you no longer remember, about a topic you weren't even focused on at the time. The idea survived. The receipt didn't. Try this. For one day, keep a small mental, or literal, log of 5 opinions or preferences you express with confidence, a restaurant you'd recommend, a political view, a belief about how to raise children, whatever comes up naturally. For each one, try honestly to trace it back to its actual origin. You will likely find that at least 2 or 3 of the 5 cannot be traced with any confidence at all. That gap is not a personal failing. It's the mechanism this entire book examines, observed directly in your own mind for the first time. Key idea: people don't resist ideas they believe are their own. Suggestion works by relocating the perceived origin of an idea, not by increasing its logical strength. The rest of this book is a map of that relocation, how it happens, how it's engineered deliberately, and where engineering it stops being help and starts being harm. Chapter 2, The Illusion of Free Will, How the Brain Constructs Ownership. In the early 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran an experiment that still unsettles people who hear about it for the first time, decades later. He asked subjects to flick their wrist whenever they felt a spontaneous urge to do so, while watching a fast-moving clock and noting the exact moment they became consciously aware of deciding to move. Meanwhile, electrodes on their scalp recorded a specific pattern of brain activity called the readiness potential, a slow build-up of electrical activity in the motor cortex that reliably precedes voluntary movement. Libet found something that has been debated, replicated, refined, and argued over ever since: the readiness potential, the brain activity associated with initiating the movement, began, on average, several hundred milliseconds before subjects reported becoming consciously aware of deciding to move. The brain, in some meaningful sense, appeared to have already started the process before the conscious "I decided this" arrived. The interpretation of this finding is genuinely contested among neuroscientists and philosophers, and I don't want to oversell it. There are serious methodological critiques, and reasonable researchers disagree about what the readiness potential actually represents. But you don't need to accept the most extreme reading, "free will is an illusion, full stop," to take the useful, well-supported lesson from it. The felt sense of "I decided this, right now, for my own reasons" is itself a psychological experience that your brain constructs, not a direct window into the causal history of the decision. And like any constructed experience, it can be constructed around material that didn't originate the way it feels like it did. The spotlight metaphor. Think of the mind's sense of ownership like a spotlight operator working slightly behind the action on a stage. The spotlight always finds something standing under it and declares, with total conviction, "That's the star." That's what this scene was about. It rarely pauses to ask who walked onto the stage first, who was already standing there when the lights came up, or who quietly nudged them into position before the spotlight arrived. This is why suggestion isn't, in its most effective form, about overriding someone's will through force or trickery in the moment of decision. It's about supplying the raw material early enough, and gently enough, that when the felt sense of deciding finally arrives, that internal click of certainty, it wraps itself around your material by default, because your material was already standing closest to where the light was going to land. Later research, the feeling of authorship. Related research on what psychologists call the sense of agency backs this up from a different angle. In studies using a technique where researchers subtly influence a participant's choice, for instance, through priming, timing, or environmental cues, while the participant believes they are choosing entirely freely, participants consistently report a strong, confident sense that the choice was self-generated, even when researchers can demonstrate, from the outside, that the choice was measurably nudged. The feeling of authorship and the actual causal history of a decision are, it turns out, two separate systems that usually agree with each other, but don't have to. This matters enormously for anyone trying to understand suggestion, because it explains why direct denial, "I didn't decide that because you said something, I decided it myself," is not evidence against suggestion having occurred. The felt sense of authorship is generated whether or not the material being authored originated internally. Denial, in other words, is exactly what you'd expect to hear whether or not suggestion took place, which is precisely why the technique is so durable and so hard to argue someone out of, even when you can see it happening from the outside. A worked example. Picture two colleagues, Maya and Daniel, in a planning meeting. Early in the meeting, almost as an aside, Maya says, "It'd be nice if we didn't have to rush the launch this time." Nobody responds. The meeting moves on to other topics for 20 minutes. Near the end, Daniel, who has forgotten Maya said anything at all, proposes, with visible enthusiasm, that they push the launch date back by 2 weeks to actually do it right. He believes, sincerely, that this is his idea, born from his own concern for quality. In a narrow, technical sense, it is his idea. He's the one who formed the specific proposal, chose the 2-week figure, and voiced it to the group. But the seed, the felt sense that rushing was a problem worth solving, was planted 20 minutes earlier, by someone else, and the planting was forgotten before the flower appeared. Neither Maya nor Daniel needs to be doing anything manipulative here for this to happen. This is simply how normal human cognition operates in groups. The chapters that follow describe what happens when someone does this on purpose, with a specific outcome in mind. Try this. Next time you're in a group conversation or meeting, try planting a single, low-stakes idea early, not by stating it as a proposal, but by voicing it as a passing thought or mild preference, with no follow-up. Say nothing more about it. Note, later in the conversation, whether anyone else independently arrives at something close to it, and whether they seem to experience it as their own idea. You are not trying to manipulate anyone towards something harmful here. Pick something genuinely neutral or beneficial, like suggesting the group take a short break or consider a slightly different meeting time. The goal is simply to observe the mechanism operating cleanly in a setting where nothing is at stake. Key idea: the feeling of free choice is real as an experience, but it is not proof of independent origin. Suggestion works upstream of that feeling, not against it, which is exactly why arguing with someone about where their idea really came from almost never works, and was never the right tool for the job in the first place. Chapter 3: The Seed in the Soil, Priming in the Unconscious Mind. Priming is the best documented mechanism in this book, and the easiest to demonstrate in a controlled setting. Show someone a list of words related to old age, wrinkle, Florida, bingo, gray, forgetful, without ever using the word old or elderly anywhere in the list, and, in the classic study by John Barg and colleagues, measurable numbers of people walked more slowly down a hallway afterward than a control group shown neutral words unrelated to aging. They did not know why. If asked directly, they denied any connection between the word list and their walking speed, and most seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. This is priming, exposure to a stimulus that does not instruct behavior directly, but quietly adjusts the probability of related thoughts, associations, and actions that follow, entirely outside conscious awareness. Why the metaphor matters. The metaphor worth keeping is agricultural, not mechanical, and the distinction is not just poetic, it changes how you should actually use this. You are not installing an idea like a part in a machine, where the part either fits or it doesn't and the outcome is deterministic. You are conditioning soil. Priming doesn't force a specific thought to grow, it changes which thoughts find fertile ground and which ones wither for lack of nutrients. Say the word trust in passing, several times, in the minutes before a negotiation, and trust-related interpretations of ambiguous later statements become measurably more likely to take root in the listener's mind than suspicion-related interpretations would have been. Nothing was commanded. Nobody was told, "Trust me." The soil was simply prepared in advance, so that when an ambiguous moment arrived, a pause, a vague answer, a slightly evasive phrase, the listener's mind reached for the most available interpretation, and the most available interpretation was the one the priming had made cheap and easy to retrieve. It's worth being honest here about a real controversy in this field. The replication crisis in psychology hit priming research particularly hard, and some of the most famous early priming studies, including certain follow-ups to the walking speed study, have proven difficult to replicate at the original effect sizes under stricter modern experimental conditions. This doesn't mean priming isn't real. The underlying mechanism, spreading activation in associative memory networks, is one of the most solid findings in cognitive psychology, confirmed across decades of reaction time studies. But it does mean the effect is often smaller, more context-dependent, and more fragile than the more sensational popular accounts suggest. Priming tilts probabilities. It doesn't guarantee outcomes, and treating it as a magic switch will lead you to overestimate what you can reliably produce in any single conversation. 3 practical forms. 3 practical forms of priming show up constantly in real conversations, and it's worth being able to name each one, because they operate through slightly different channels. Semantic priming is the use of words associated with the idea you eventually want to land, introduced well before you state the idea itself. If you want someone to feel that a new opportunity is exciting rather than risky, you don't need to argue that it's exciting. You can simply use words like adventure, momentum, and breakthrough in the surrounding conversation, well before the opportunity itself comes up, so that when it does arrive, it's received into a mental environment already primed to interpret it favorably. Conceptual priming works one level up from individual words, telling a short, seemingly unrelated story or anecdote that carries the underlying theme: trust, risk, opportunity, safety, betrayal. You want active in the listener's mind when your real point arrives. A manager who wants a team to feel more comfortable taking a calculated risk might mention, in passing, a story about a past project where playing it too safe led to a worse outcome than a bold move would have. The story isn't presented as an argument for the current decision. It's presented as a passing anecdote. But it primes the conceptual frame. Safety can be its own kind of risk that will shape how the team interprets the actual decision minutes later. Environmental priming operates through the physical setting itself, rather than through language at all. A tidy, orderly, formally arranged room tends to prime conscientious, rule-following, cautious responses in the people inside it. This has been shown across contexts from voting behavior to honesty in economic games. A relaxed, informal setting, soft lighting, comfortable seating, background music, primes openness, informality, and greater risk tolerance. This is why important negotiations are rarely conducted standing up in a hallway, and why a first date at a candlelit restaurant produces a different emotional register than the same conversation held under fluorescent office lighting, even if every word spoken were identical. A composite example. Imagine a salesperson preparing to pitch a premium, higher-priced product to a hesitant client. In the early minutes of the meeting, before the product is even mentioned, she mentions, almost as small talk, a recent trip she took, worth every penny. Honestly, some things you just don't want to compromise on. This is semantic and conceptual priming working together. The phrase worth every penny and the theme of not compromising on quality are now active in the client's mind, unconnected, as far as the client consciously knows, to the pitch that follows. She's chosen a well-appointed, quiet meeting room rather than a noisy open-plan space. Environmental priming, reinforcing a sense of premium quality before a single feature is described. By the time she introduces the actual product and its price, she hasn't argued that it's worth the cost. She has spent 10 minutes making worth the cost the most available interpretive frame in the room. Try this. Before your next important conversation, a request for a raise, a difficult conversation with a partner, a pitch to a client, spend 2 minutes beforehand identifying the single concept you most want active in the other person's mind: trust, opportunity, fairness, relief, momentum. Then, in the 5 minutes of small talk before you get to your actual point, look for one natural, honest opportunity to use language or share a brief, true anecdote connected to that concept, without connecting it explicitly to what's coming. Notice, afterward, whether the tone of the actual conversation felt different than it typically does when you skip this step. Key idea: you rarely need to argue for an idea if you've already made it the most cognitively available one in the room. Priming doesn't overpower judgment, it quietly decides which raw material judgment has on hand to work with. Chapter 4: The Question That Answers Itself, Socratic Suggestion. Socrates, as far as we can tell from Plato's dialogues, almost never told his students they were wrong. He asked them questions, patient, precise, seemingly innocent questions, until they discovered, in their own words, using their own reasoning, that a belief they'd held with total confidence a few minutes earlier didn't actually hold together. And the discovery landed with far more force than any lecture could have, for a simple reason: they couldn't tell themselves it came from someone else. It came from inside the very argument they'd been making. This is the oldest form of suggestion on record, and still the most respected, because it is also the most honest of all the techniques in this book. It doesn't hide the origin of the idea so much as genuinely hand the construction of the idea over to the other person, using questions as scaffolding they climb themselves. Why questions land differently than statements? There's a well-established asymmetry in how the brain processes assertions versus questions. A direct statement, "You're not communicating risks early enough," is received by the listener's mind as a claim to be evaluated, and evaluation, particularly of claims that touch on our competence or judgment, reflexively activates a kind of internal defense counsel. The listener starts building a case for the other side before you've even finished the sentence, often without meaning to. A question, by contrast, doesn't present a claim to defend against. It presents an open slot the mind is obligated, almost reflexively, to try to fill. There's no defense counsel to activate, because nothing has been asserted yet. You've simply been handed a small cognitive task, and human minds are compulsive about completing cognitive tasks that are put in front of them. The mechanics, in sequence. Instead of stating a conclusion, you ask a short sequence of questions that has, by design, essentially one reasonable destination, while never once naming that destination yourself. What tends to happen to a team's trust when a deadline gets missed without any warning beforehand? The listener answers, probably with something like, "Trust erodes, people feel blindsided, it's worse than the delay itself." And in your experience, what usually stops someone from flagging a risk 2 weeks early instead of 2 days early? The listener answers with something honest, fear of looking incompetent, hoping the problem resolves itself, not wanting to seem like they're raising alarms too soon. So if someone on the team did flag a risk 2 weeks out instead of 2 days out, even if it turned out to be nothing, what would that actually do for how the team operates? By now, the listener is constructing, in their own words, the exact conclusion you would have stated in one sentence at the start. We need to communicate risks earlier. Nobody told them this. They built it, out of their own answers, using their own vocabulary, their own examples, their own reasoning. It will stick harder than the same instruction delivered directly, because a large body of research on what's sometimes called the self-generation effect shows that people remember, and defend, conclusions they actively construct far more robustly than conclusions they merely receive. The discipline this technique demands. The discipline required here is resisting the overwhelming urge to supply the punchline yourself. Most people who attempt Socratic suggestion for the first time fail at exactly the last step. They get impatient, sense the listener is almost there, and simply state the conclusion the questions were building toward, as if to help. That single sentence undoes the entire effect, because it reintroduces you, visibly, as the source of the idea, at the exact moment the listener was about to claim it as their own. The conclusion, once you've said it aloud, is now something you handed them, and something handed to a person can always be handed back, argued with, or resisted, in a way that something they built cannot. Let the silence after the final question sit, even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it takes 10 full seconds. The other person needs that silence to complete the sentence themselves, and every second you fill with your own words is a second you're stealing the construction back. A note on when this technique fails. Socratic suggestion doesn't work well when the listener is defensive, rushed, or already suspects they're being led somewhere. In those states, questions get processed with the same skepticism as statements, and the listener may simply refuse to answer honestly, or answer with visible irritation. Just tell me what you're getting at. The technique depends on genuine curiosity being present in your tone, not just your grammar. A question asked with an agenda audible underneath it reads as a trap, not an invitation, and traps get resisted far harder than honest disagreements do. This is why the best practitioners of Socratic suggestion, good therapists, in particular, often report that they need to genuinely not know the answer in advance, or at least hold their expected answer loosely, because certainty leaks through tone of voice in ways that are very hard to fake. Try this. The next time someone you're close to is stuck on a decision and asks for your opinion, resist giving it, at least at first. Instead, ask 3 questions in sequence, each one building on their previous answer, without stating your own view anywhere in the exchange. See if they arrive somewhere on their own, and notice how different their tone of ownership sounds compared to the times you've simply told them what you think. Key idea: a conclusion someone builds is a conclusion they own, and they will defend it accordingly. A conclusion you hand them is a conclusion they can hand back the moment it becomes inconvenient. Chapter 5: Anchors in the Dark, How First Impressions Shape Every Choice After. Anchoring is the tendency for an initial piece of information to disproportionately influence every judgment that follows it, even, remarkably, when the anchor is arbitrary, known to be irrelevant, or explicitly labeled as random by the very people relying on it. In one of the most cited demonstrations of this effect, conducted by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, people watched a wheel of fortune, visibly rigged by the experimenters, though participants weren't told this, to land on either a low number or a high number. Immediately afterward, they were asked to estimate the percentage of African countries that were members of the United Nations, a question with no logical, causal, or topical connection to a spinning wheel. Participants who saw the wheel land on a high number gave significantly higher percentage estimates than participants who saw it land on a low number. They were fully aware the wheel was random. Many even said so out loud. Their estimates were distorted by it anyway, and the distortion was large and consistent across the sample. Why anchors work even when we know better? The dominant explanation, developed further in later decades of research, is that people generate estimates through a process of anchor and adjust. They start from whatever number is currently active in mind, regardless of its source, and adjust away from it toward what feels like a more accurate answer. The problem is that this adjustment process is systematically insufficient. People stop adjusting too early, well before they reach the value they'd have landed on if they'd started fresh, because each incremental adjustment feels, in the moment, like it's getting close enough, and the mind is reluctant to keep expending effort past the point of plausible. This explains something that seems, on its face, almost impossible, that a number you know is meaningless can still shape a judgment you care about getting right. The anchor isn't believed. It's simply used as a starting point, and starting points determine destinations more than most people intuitively expect. Anchoring matters to suggestion because of sequence. Anchoring matters to the discipline of suggestion because it explains why the order in which you introduce ideas, numbers, or options matters just as much as the content of the ideas themselves, often more. Whatever number, option, or framing arrives first in a conversation sets a gravitational center that every subsequent judgment gets pulled toward, including judgments the listener sincerely believes are being made completely fresh, uninfluenced by anything said earlier. This is why skilled negotiators, almost without exception, try to speak first, and speak with a deliberately ambitious opening number, not because they expect to get that number, but because every subsequent negotiation move, from either side, will now be measured against it rather than against some neutral, unbiased baseline. It's why real estate listings are frequently priced slightly above what the seller privately expects to receive, so that the eventual, lower accepted offer still feels, to the buyer, like a good outcome relative to the anchor they saw first. And it's why a suggestion planted early in an emotionally difficult conversation, this could take a while to sort out, and it might get harder before it gets easier, makes a later, comparatively easy resolution feel like genuine relief, rather than the unremarkable, default outcome it may actually have been all along. Anchoring beyond numbers. It's worth noting that anchoring isn't limited to numerical estimates, even though that's where the original research focused. Emotional anchors work the same way. The first emotional tone struck in a conversation, anxious, warm, formal, playful, becomes the reference point against which everything that follows is felt, not just thought. A difficult conversation that opens with warmth, "I really value how much you care about this, and that's part of why I want to talk it through," sets an emotional anchor of goodwill that softens the interpretation of the harder points that follow. The same difficult conversation, opened instead with a clipped, formal tone, sets an anchor of distance that will color the same subsequent words as colder and more adversarial than they were actually intended. A worked example. Consider a freelancer negotiating a project fee. Rather than waiting to be asked what she charges, she opens by mentioning, conversationally, a recent project of similar scope that came in around double what she expects this one to cost, establishing, before any number related to this specific project has been discussed, an anchor considerably higher than her actual target. When she eventually states her real rate, it lands, by comparison to the anchor already sitting in the client's mind, as reasonable, even modest, even though, presented cold, with no anchor at all, the same client might have hesitated at the identical figure. Try this. Before your next conversation involving a number you care about, a salary discussion, a price negotiation, even something as small as agreeing on how long a task should take, notice what the first number mentioned in the conversation actually is, and by whom. If it's not you, notice how much work you have to do, consciously, to pull your own estimate away from it. Then try, in a lower stakes conversation, deliberately introducing a well-considered, honest anchor early, and observe how it shapes what follows. Key idea: the first thing said in a conversation is rarely the most important thing said in terms of content, but it is very often the most important thing said in terms of consequence. It's the ruler everything after gets measured against, whether or not anyone in the room ever notices the ruler was placed there deliberately. Chapter 6: The Mirror Effect, Mimicry, Rapport, and Trust. Before any idea can be suggested successfully, the suggester has to clear a more basic, more primitive hurdle first. The listener's threat detection system has to relax. A brilliant, subtle, well-timed suggestion offered by someone the listener's nervous system has already flagged, even unconsciously, as outsider or potential threat will be rejected on contact, before its content is even properly processed, because the nervous system's job is to protect first and evaluate second, and it does not wait for permission to do so. This is where mimicry comes in, one of the oldest, most primitive trust signals in human social interaction, operating almost entirely below conscious awareness, in both the person doing it and the person receiving it. The chameleon effect. When two people are in a state of genuine rapport, they unconsciously synchronize with each other across multiple channels at once. Posture shifts to mirror posture. Speech pace and rhythm begin to match, tone of voice converges, gesture size and frequency align, and even breathing rhythm can synchronize over the course of a sustained conversation. Researchers Tanya Chartrand and John Bard named this the chameleon effect, in a set of studies showing that it runs in both directions. People who are subtly, naturally mimicked by a conversational partner report liking that partner more, trusting them more, and reading their arguments and requests as more persuasive, all without being able to say why, and often without noticing the mimicry occurred at all when asked about it afterward. The mechanism makes clear evolutionary sense once you consider the ancestral environment it evolved in. Synchrony was, for most of human history, a reasonably reliable signal of same tribe, same team, moving through the world at the same rhythm as me, therefore probably safe. A nervous system that registers behavioral synchrony automatically downgrades its threat assessment of the person producing it. This isn't a decision made consciously, it's closer to a reflex, operating far below the level of deliberate thought, in the same category as flinching at a loud noise. Why this has to come first? It's worth stating plainly why this chapter comes before most of the specific verbal techniques later in the book, even though, chronologically, you might expect language-based tools to matter more. Every technique from Chapter 4 onward, Socratic questions, anchoring, framing, embedded stories, depends on the listener's evaluative defenses being at least partially lowered before the technique has any chance to work. A perfectly executed Socratic question, delivered by someone the listener's nervous system has already categorized as adversarial, will be heard as an interrogation, not an invitation, and will produce defensiveness rather than genuine reflection. The order matters. Rapport is not one tool among many in this book. It's closer to the soil every other tool needs in order to grow anything at all, which is why it comes early, right after the two foundational chapters on why the mind is vulnerable to suggestion in the first place. How to build it without faking it. Practically, this means the first work of genuine suggestion isn't verbal at all, it's matching, and matching has to be done carefully, because the research here contains an important warning most popular summaries leave out. Matching someone's pace of speech before introducing a new idea, matching their general energy level, reflecting their own vocabulary and phrasing back to them rather than introducing your own. These build rapport when they happen naturally, as a byproduct of genuinely paying close attention to another person. but forced, mechanical, obvious mimicry, consciously copying someone's exact posture a beat after they move, or repeating their last 3 words back to them like a customer service script, reads as mockery or manipulation almost immediately, and destroys trust faster than no mimicry at all would have. Several follow-up studies on the chameleon effect found that mimicry that becomes noticeable stops producing the positive trust effect and can reverse it entirely. The goal, in other words, is attunement, not imitation. Attunement means actually tracking the other person closely enough, their pace, their mood, their word choices, what seems to matter to them in this specific conversation. That synchrony happens as a natural side effect of real attention, the way it does between old friends or between a skilled listener and someone they're genuinely trying to understand. This is, incidentally, why the single most reliable way to build rapport quickly is not a mimicry technique at all, but simply putting your phone away, making real eye contact, and listening with the specific intention of understanding rather than the intention of formulating your next point. Mimicry, done well, isn't really a separate skill from good listening. It's what good listening produces automatically. A brief case study. A hostage negotiator interviewed in several published accounts of crisis negotiation training describes deliberately slowing his own speech rate and lowering his volume when speaking with an agitated person on the other end of a phone line, not as a scripted trick, but as a way of inviting the other person's physiological state to entrain to his. Over several minutes, in many documented cases, the other person's own speech measurably slows and quiets to match. This is the chameleon effect operating at a physiological level, under conditions where the stakes could not be higher, and it's used precisely because rapport, established this way, has to exist before any actual suggestion, put the weapon down, let's talk about a way out of this, has any chance of landing as help rather than as a demand from an adversary. Try this. In your next few conversations, resist the urge to consciously mimic anything. Instead, practice a different skill, withhold your own opinion or response for slightly longer than feels natural, and use that extra time to genuinely notice the other person's pace, tone, and energy. Let your own delivery shift toward theirs, not as a technique, but as an honest response to having actually paid attention. Notice whether the conversation feels different, looser, warmer, by the time you get to whatever point you actually wanted to make. Key idea: trust is a precondition for suggestion, not a byproduct of it. Establish synchrony first, through genuine attention rather than performed technique. Introduce ideas second. Skip the first step and the second one will consistently underperform, no matter how well crafted the idea is. Chapter 7. The Power of Almost, Using Ambiguity to Invite Participation. Complete, airtight statements leave no room for a listener to participate in constructing them, and participation, as the last several chapters have shown from different angles, is what converts a heard idea into an own one. Ambiguity, used deliberately and with care, is one of the most underrated tools in the entire suggestion toolkit, precisely because it runs against most people's intuition that clarity and precision are always persuasive virtues. A statement that is almost complete, that gestures toward a conclusion without fully stating it, forces the listener's mind to do the work of closing the gap itself. And minds, built as pattern completion engines at nearly every level of processing, from vision to language to social inference, cannot easily resist finishing an open pattern once it's been presented to them. Whatever conclusion they use to close that gap will feel like their own contribution, because, in the most literal, mechanical sense, it was. The cold reading demonstration. Cold readers, fortune tellers, psychics, and, less dramatically but using the identical mechanism, skilled interviewers and interrogators all rely on a version of this technique, statements vague enough to plausibly fit a very wide range of specific situations, delivered with enough calm confidence that the listener supplies the specific personal detail that makes the statement land as startlingly, individually accurate. There's something about a decision you've been putting off fits an enormous majority of adults at almost any given moment. Nearly everyone has some undecided matter sitting somewhere in the back of their mind. The listener, not the speaker, does the work of filling in which decision, generating specific, emotionally resonant details on their own, and then, this is the crucial final step, misattributing the accuracy of their own contribution to the speaker's supposed insight. The speaker said almost nothing. The listener supplied everything that made it feel true, and then credited the speaker for it. Researchers who study this phenomenon call the broader effect subjective validation, our tendency to find personal meaning in confirming detail in a statement that is, examined objectively, generic enough to apply to almost anyone. It is the single most important mechanism behind the persistent popularity of horoscopes, generic personality tests, and cold reading performances of every kind, and it works precisely because the ambiguity does the inviting, and the listener's own mind does the confirming. Applying this outside a cold reading context. Applied to everyday, ethical suggestion, this looks like deliberately trailing off mid-sentence. I keep thinking about what would happen if you actually took that risk, and then stopping there, genuinely, without finishing the thought. The unfinished sentence recruits the listener's own imagination to complete it, to picture, in their own specific terms, drawn from their own life and their own hopes, what taking the risk might actually look like. And an imagined outcome, generated internally by the listener's own mind, carries measurably more emotional and motivational weight than the identical outcome would carry if it had simply been stated to them directly, in full, by someone else. This connects back to a broader finding in psychology sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect. Incomplete tasks and unfinished thoughts are remembered better, and held in mind longer, than completed ones. An unfinished sentence about a possible future doesn't just invite participation in the moment, it tends to keep working on the listener's mind afterward, in a way a fully closed statement typically does not, because the mind treats it as unfinished business rather than settled information. Calibration is the whole skill. The skill here, and it is a genuine skill, not something that works automatically the moment you start leaving sentences unfinished, is calibration. Too much ambiguity, and the listener has nothing concrete to grab onto, the trailing sentence reads as vague, even confusing, and produces no completion at all, just a slightly awkward pause. Too little ambiguity, and you've simply made a complete statement in a slightly theatrical way, closing the loop yourself before the listener had any real opening to close it themselves, and losing the entire participation effect in the process. The sweet spot is a sentence with an open door and a clear direction, enough structure and context to point somewhere specific, not so much that it walks the listener all the way through the doorway itself. I keep thinking about what would happen if you actually took that risk. Points clearly toward a positive imagined outcome. The surrounding tone and context make that much unambiguous, without stating what that outcome actually is, which is precisely the gap the listener's mind will now, almost involuntarily, move to fill. A worked example. A manager wants to suggest, without directly instructing, that a hesitant employee is ready for more responsibility. Instead of saying, "I think you're ready for a promotion," a complete statement the employee might reflexively downplay or argue against out of modesty or anxiety. She says, "In a one-on-one meeting, watching how you handled that last project, I keep thinking about what you'd do with a bit more room to run." And then moves the conversation elsewhere, deliberately, without circling back. Over the following days, the employee finds themselves returning to that sentence, filling in the specifics themselves, what more room to run might mean, what they do with it, whether they actually want it. By the time a real conversation about promotion happens, weeks later, the employee has already spent significant time constructing the idea as their own aspiration, rather than receiving it, cold, as someone else's assessment of them. Try this. In a low-stakes, warm conversation this week, practice deliberately trailing off once, mid-thought, at a moment where the direction is clear but the specific content isn't stated. "I have a feeling about how this year is going to go for you," and then genuinely let the silence sit, resisting the strong urge to finish your own sentence. Notice what the other person does with the gap, and notice how much more engaged they seem with a thought they're actively constructing than with one they're passively receiving. Key idea: people don't just remember what you finished saying. They remember, far more vividly and durably, what they finished for you, and they will defend that self-completed thought as though it were entirely their own discovery, because in the specific, meaningful sense that matters most to memory and motivation, it was. Chapter 8, Framing Reality, Language as a Suggestion Engine. The same underlying fact, described in different words, produces reliably different decisions from the people who hear it, a finding so well replicated across contexts, medicine, finance, politics, everyday persuasion, that it counts as one of the more secure findings in all of behavioral science. The classic demonstration, from research by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, involved people choosing between medical treatments described in one of two mathematically identical ways, one framed around a 90% survival rate, the other framed around an equivalent 10% mortality rate. Across multiple studies, and across both medical professionals and members of the public, people overwhelmingly preferred the treatment described in terms of survival over the mathematically identical treatment described in terms of mortality, despite the fact that, on paper, choosing between them should have been indifferent. The information conveyed hadn't changed by a single data point. The frame around the information had, and the frame did real, measurable work that the underlying numbers alone did not do. Framing is suggestion at the level of vocabulary. Framing is suggestion operating at the most fundamental level available to language, the level of individual word choice. Every word carries not just a literal, dictionary-definable meaning but also a connotation, an emotional and moral coloring that does real argumentative work the literal meaning does not do on its own. Calling a government policy a tax versus a contribution. Calling a price increase a loss you'll experience versus money you'll be saving by acting now. Calling a difficult, necessary conversation a confrontation versus a check-in. Calling the same piece of legislation estate tax versus death tax, a real and well-studied example from political communication research that produced measurably different levels of public support for the identical policy depending purely on which of the two names was used in survey questions. The underlying reality in each case is entirely unchanged. The emotional and moral coloring surrounding it is not, and that coloring measurably moves real decisions, real votes, and real dollars. A closer look at 4 specific frames. A few specific frames are worth knowing by name in detail, because they appear constantly, in forms both obvious and disguised, across advertising, negotiation, parenting, and politics. Loss framing. Describing an option in terms of what will be lost by not taking it, rather than what will be gained by taking it. This connects directly to loss aversion, one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics. People respond more strongly, and more consistently, to the prospect of a loss than to an equivalently sized potential gain. The psychological pain of losing something is measured, across many studies, as roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the identical thing. A retailer's sale ends tonight, don't miss out produces stronger action than the logically equivalent buy now and save, even though the underlying financial outcome for the customer is identical either way. Identity framing. Connecting a choice to who the listener already believes themselves to be, rather than to a cost-benefit calculation about the choice itself. People who take their career seriously usually make time for this kind of thing recruits the listener's self-concept, their desire to see themselves, and be seen, as someone who takes their career seriously, rather than asking them to weigh costs and benefits in the abstract. This frame is especially powerful because disagreeing with it requires the listener to either accept the implied unflattering identity, "I guess I don't take my career that seriously," or comply with the suggestion, and most people, given that choice, will quietly comply rather than accept the unflattering self-description, even when they never consciously notice the frame doing this work. Default framing. Describing one option as the standard, expected, already in motion path, and the alternative as an active deviation that requires justification and effort to choose. This is why organ donation rates differ dramatically between countries that use an opt-in system, "You must actively register to donate," versus an opt-out system, "You are a donor by default unless you actively deregister." The default framing alone, with the actual substantive choice held constant, produces enormous differences in real-world outcomes, sometimes moving participation rates from single digits to over 90%. Comparative framing. Presenting an option alongside a deliberately weaker or more expensive alternative, not because anyone expects the weaker alternative to be chosen, but because its presence changes how the target option is perceived. A subscription service offering a digital-only plan at $8 and a digital and print plan at the same $8 right next to a print-only plan also priced at $8 will drive a large share of buyers toward the digital and print option, not because it's actually the best value in isolation, but because the print-only option, priced identically, makes it look obviously superior by comparison. This is sometimes called the decoy effect, and it demonstrates that framing isn't limited to language. It extends to how options are arranged and juxtaposed against each other. Why this is unusually easy to use responsibly. None of these 4 techniques require adding false information to what you're communicating. That's part of what makes framing simultaneously one of the most powerful tools in this book and one of the easier ones to use in a genuinely responsible way. You are choosing which true thing to emphasize and which vocabulary to wrap it in, not inventing an untrue thing to say. The suggestion lives entirely in the selection and the wording, which is exactly why it so rarely gets consciously noticed by the listener, let alone actively resisted, and exactly why it places real responsibility on the person doing the framing to choose frames that illuminate rather than distort. Try this. Take a request or an idea you genuinely believe would benefit someone else, asking a friend to join you at the gym, proposing a change at work, suggesting a family member see a doctor, and write it out twice, once using loss framing, once using gain framing. Read both out loud. Notice which one you're instinctively drawn to using, and consider whether that instinct matches what would actually serve the other person best, rather than simply what would be most persuasive. Key idea: you are never just delivering neutral information to another person. You are always also delivering a frame around that information, whether you choose it deliberately or default to whatever frame happens to be lying around. The only real question available to you is whether the frame you use was actually chosen on purpose. Chapter 9. The third option: choice architecture and guided autonomy. Give someone a completely open, unstructured question. What do you want to do? And you frequently invite paralysis, or an answer that has little to do with the outcome you were genuinely hoping to help them reach. Give someone exactly one option, take it or leave it, and you invite resistance, because a single option doesn't feel like a choice at all. It feels like an instruction wearing a choice's clothing, and people, generally, do not like being instructed. Choice architecture, a term popularized by economists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, is the practice of deliberately designing the set of options someone chooses from, so that every genuinely available path leads somewhere acceptable, ideally somewhere good, while the actual experience of choosing remains meaningfully, honestly theirs. Why this is not the same as a false choice. It's worth being precise about the distinction this chapter depends on, because it's easy to blur. This is not about rigging a fake choice between something terrible and something you secretly want. Would you rather do the report now, or lose your job? That kind of false choice structure collapses into obvious, resented manipulation the moment it's noticed, and it usually is noticed, because the disproportion between the options gives the game away immediately. Genuine choice architecture is about narrowing an overwhelming or vague field of possibilities down to a small number of options that are all genuinely different from each other, all genuinely reasonable, and all outcomes you'd honestly be glad to see the other person choose. The classic parenting example, extended. A parent doesn't ask a reluctant young child, "Do you want to get dressed?" A yes/no question that flatly invites the answer no, with nothing productive to do afterward, nor do they simply dress the resistant child themselves, removing the experience of choice entirely and typically producing more resistance, not less, in the process. Instead, they ask, "Do you want to wear the blue shirt or the red one?" The child experiences real, genuine agency in this exchange. They are actively choosing between two things that meaningfully differ from each other, and that choice is respected once made. The parent, meanwhile, has quietly ensured that both branches of the choice terminate in the same functional outcome: dressed, on time, without a battle. What makes this example useful beyond parenting is noticing exactly why it works, mechanically, because the same structure scales up to far higher stakes adult contexts. The child isn't being deceived about anything, both shirts are real, both are genuinely available, and the child's actual preference between them is genuinely honored. The architecture operates entirely at the level above the choice being presented, in deciding, in advance, which options make it onto the table at all. Where this shows up in adult life. The same architecture appears constantly in contexts adults move through every day, often without noticing the design behind it. Product pricing frequently uses a three-tier structure: a basic tier, a middle tier, and a premium tier, with the middle tier deliberately engineered, through relative pricing and feature bundling, to look like the obvious, sensible value choice. Most customers who might otherwise have chosen the cheapest option end up gravitating to the middle one, not because they were forced to, but because the surrounding architecture made it feel like the natural, moderate choice between two extremes. Default retirement plan contribution rates offer one of the best-studied real-world examples. Employees automatically enrolled in a retirement plan at a modest contribution rate, with the ability to opt out or change the rate at any time, end up saving significantly more, on average, than employees who must actively opt into any contribution at all, even though, in both systems, every employee retains complete freedom to choose their own rate, including zero. The architecture of the default, not any restriction on choice, drives the difference. In negotiation, offering a counterpart two different deal structures to choose between, rather than a single number to simply accept or reject, changes the psychological experience of the negotiation entirely. A single number invites a binary, adversarial yes or no evaluation. Two structures invite the counterpart into an active, collaborative feeling process of comparing and selecting, even when, upstream, you would have been reasonably satisfied with either structure they might choose. The deeper claim about freedom. Done honestly, with real, meaningfully different options that you'd genuinely be glad to see chosen, choice architecture arguably respects autonomy more than it erodes it. There's good evidence from decision science research on what's sometimes called choice overload that unlimited, unstructured options are not actually experienced by most people as pure freedom. They're frequently experienced as burden, anxiety, and decision fatigue, and can lead to worse decisions, more regret, and, in some studies, a reduced likelihood of choosing anything at all. A well-curated, honestly constructed set of good options can function as a genuine gift to someone facing a decision, not a trick played on them. Done dishonestly, narrowing the field specifically to hide a worse deal among artificially inflated decoy options, or presenting only options that serve the architect's interests while disguising the existence of better alternatives the other person would have wanted to know about, it becomes exactly the manipulation this book keeps drawing a firm line around. And Chapter 14 will give you concrete tools for telling the two apart in your own conduct. Try this. The next time you need someone else to make a decision, a colleague, a partner, a client, resist presenting either a single take it or leave it option or a completely open-ended question. Instead, construct 2 or 3 genuinely different, genuinely reasonable options in advance, each one an outcome you'd honestly be comfortable with, and present those. Notice whether the resulting conversation feels more collaborative, and whether the other person seems more satisfied with, and more committed to, whatever they choose. Key idea: removing bad options from someone's field of view isn't removing their freedom. Done honestly, it's designing the actual conditions under which their freedom becomes usable rather than overwhelming. The manipulation only begins when the options on the table stop honestly representing what's genuinely available. Chapter 10: The Herd Within, Social Proof and Suggestion. Humans are, by a wide margin, the most successful cooperative species on the planet, and a substantial part of that success traces back to a deep, evolved default, trusting the observed behavior of the group over one's own individual, from-scratch assessment of a novel situation. If everyone around you suddenly starts running, the evolutionarily correct move, across the vast majority of ancestral situations our psychology was shaped by, is almost never to stop, gather independent evidence, and personally verify that a threat actually exists before reacting. The individuals who stopped to verify, across countless generations, tended not to pass on that particular deliberative habit. Social proof is the suggestion technique that exploits this deep default directly and explicitly, the well-documented observation that people infer correctness, safety, quality, and desirability from what other people are visibly already doing, frequently in place of, not merely alongside, independent evaluation of the thing itself. Why most people choose this works better than an argument. Most people in your situation end up choosing does more real persuasive work, sentence for sentence, than a full page of carefully constructed independent reasoning, and understanding why reveals something important about how this technique differs from most of the others in this book. It doesn't ask the listener to evaluate an argument on its logical merits at all. It asks them to recognize a pattern they are already strongly predisposed, by deep evolutionary default, to trust and follow. Restaurants with a visible line of people waiting outside routinely sell more tables than equally good, or even objectively better, restaurants with empty tables and no wait, because the line itself functions as a claim. Many people have already judged this worth waiting for, that is more persuasive than any menu description could be. Online product reviews move purchasing decisions more reliably, in study after study, than detailed product specifications do. A packed, energetic room makes an objectively mediocre speaker sound more compelling than an empty, quiet room makes an objectively excellent speaker sound. The audience's own reactions become part of the evidence other audience members use to judge the speaker. The three conditions that determine its strength. Social proof is not uniformly powerful. Its strength varies predictably based on three conditions worth knowing explicitly, because they tell you both when the technique will land hardest and when it will barely register at all. Uncertainty. Social proof is strongest when the listener doesn't yet have a strong, independently formed opinion of their own. Someone who has already used a product extensively and formed a clear view of its quality will be far less moved by a wall of 5-star reviews than someone encountering the product for the first time with no independent basis for judgment. This is why social proof is deployed most heavily, and most effectively, at the exact moment of first encounter, the landing page, the storefront window, the opening minutes of a first conversation, rather than later, once independent judgment has had a chance to form. Similarity. Social proof lands with much greater force when the others being pointed to are perceived by the listener as genuinely similar to themselves, people in a comparable life stage, a comparable profession, a comparable set of values, rather than as distant, dissimilar strangers. Most people your age in your field end up making this switch carries far more weight than the generic, undifferentiated most people make this switch, because the former asks the listener to see themselves specifically inside the pattern being described, not just to note that a pattern exists somewhere out in the world. Visibility. Social proof depends on the behavior of others being genuinely observable, or at least credibly reportable, rather than merely asserted in the abstract. A visible line outside a restaurant is more persuasive than someone simply telling you the restaurant is popular, because you can see the evidence directly rather than having to trust a second-hand claim about it. This is part of why testimonials with specific, verifiable, named detail consistently outperform vague claims of popularity, thousands of satisfied customers, that provide no actual visible evidence to evaluate. Where this technique turns into fraud. This is also, unfortunately, the single technique in this book most easily and most commonly abused, because social proof, unlike most of the other techniques described here, can be straightforwardly fabricated rather than merely emphasized or framed. Fake product reviews, purchased social media followers, staged crowds and lines, invented statistics about what most people do, all of these manufacture the appearance of a real pattern that does not actually exist. It is worth being unambiguous about this. Fabricated social proof is not suggestion. It is fraud, wearing suggestions clothing, and the distinction matters enormously, because the entire ethical case for legitimate social proof, that it helps people benefit from real, aggregated information they couldn't easily gather on their own, collapses completely the moment the underlying information is invented rather than genuinely observed. The technique remains ethical exactly and only to the extent that the proof pointed to is real. Pointing a hesitant person toward a genuine, verifiable trend they'd otherwise have overlooked, a lot of people in your field have actually started doing this, and here's where you can see that for yourself, is legitimate, helpful suggestion. Inventing a trend that doesn't exist, or wildly exaggerating a real but modest one, to manufacture false confidence in someone who would otherwise have hesitated appropriately, is simply a lie, delivered through the specific vocabulary of social proof rather than through some other lie's vocabulary. Try this. Notice, over the next few days, every place you encounter social proof being used on you deliberately, a bestseller label, a review count, a phrase like "join thousands of others." For each one, ask yourself the uncertainty question directly: do I actually have an independent basis for judging this myself, or am I leaning on the crowd because forming my own judgment feels like more effort than it's worth right now? Notice how often the honest answer is the second one. Key idea: people rarely walk around asking themselves, is this, on the merits, a good idea, in clean isolation? Far more often, they ask, are people like me already doing this? And then quietly answer the harder first question by answering the easier second one, without ever noticing the substitution took place. Chapter 11: The Story Trick, Narrative Transportation and Belief Change. There is a well-documented psychological state, studied extensively by researchers including Richard Gehrig and Melanie Green, called narrative transportation, the experience of becoming sufficiently absorbed in a story that the normal, skeptical, fact-checking machinery of the mind measurably quiets down while the absorption lasts. While transported into a story, people are demonstrably more likely to accept the beliefs, values, and factual claims embedded within it, including beliefs they would actively resist, argue with, or counter-argue if the identical claim were presented to them as a direct, standalone assertion outside of any story at all. Why direct claims trigger resistance a story doesn't. This is why "let me tell you about someone I know" is one of the most quietly powerful sentences available in the entire suggestion toolkit, and understanding exactly why reveals something important about the architecture of persuasion generally. A direct claim, "you should negotiate harder for what you're worth," activates something researchers call counter-arguing almost immediately. The listener's mind, recognizing an assertion being made at them, begins generating objections, exceptions, and reasons for doubt, often before the sentence has even finished, because a direct claim announces itself, unmistakably, as a thing to be evaluated and potentially resisted. A story: I know someone who almost didn't negotiate, and ended up leaving $40,000 on the table without even realizing it until years later, when a friend in the same role mentioned what she was actually making, does not announce itself as an argument at all. It is received, first and foremost, as a story, a sequence of events involving a specific person, with tension, stakes, and an outcome. Only afterward, frequently well after the story has ended, is any lesson extracted from it, and that extraction often happens unconsciously, without the listener ever formally registering that they were just persuaded of something. By the time the lesson is extracted, it has already bypassed the part of the mind that evaluates direct arguments for logical soundness and rhetorical intent, because that evaluative machinery was never actually engaged in the first place. It was engaged instead with character, causality, tension, and resolution, the machinery of narrative comprehension, which operates according to an entirely different, generally far less defended set of rules. 3 elements that make a story function as suggestion. Not every story produces narrative transportation equally well, and 3 specific elements consistently distinguish stories that work as effective suggestion from stories that merely entertain without changing anything afterward. A protagonist similar enough to the listener that identification happens automatically, without being requested. The closer the story's central character resembles the listener, in age, situation, values, or circumstance, the more easily the listener's mind slips into experiencing the story from the inside, rather than observing it from a comfortable, evaluative distance. A story about someone in your exact position transports far more effectively than a story about a public figure or an abstract, generic person, because identification, once it occurs, collapses the psychological distance between the listener and the events being described. A clear, legible causal chain between the story's turning point and its outcome. The story needs to visibly demonstrate the actual mechanism at work. This specific choice led, through this specific chain of events, to this specific consequence, rather than simply reporting a result with the causal connective tissue left vague or implied. A story that merely says she didn't negotiate, and it turned out badly transports and persuades far less effectively than one that walks through exactly how the lack of negotiation compounded, year over year, through specific, concrete, imaginable steps, into a specific, large, quantified consequence. No explicit moral stated at the end. This is the single most commonly violated rule among people first learning to use stories deliberately as suggestion, and violating it is almost always fatal to the technique's effectiveness. The moment you add, and the lesson there is, you should always negotiate to the end of an otherwise well-told story, you have reintroduced yourself, abruptly and visibly, as the source of a direct claim, precisely the thing narrative transportation was working to bypass in the first place, and you undo much of the transportation effect in a single sentence. Let the story simply end, at its natural, honest conclusion. Let the silence afterward do the work of extraction, in the listener's own mind, using their own words, exactly as described in Chapter 4's discussion of Socratic questioning. The two techniques rhyme closely, because they rely on the identical underlying principle. Conclusions the listener constructs themselves outlast and outperform conclusions handed to them. A worked, extended example. Consider a founder trying to convince a hesitant co-founder to formalize their equity split in writing, early, before the company grows and the conversation becomes far more fraught. A direct claim, "We really need to sign a formal agreement now, before this gets complicated," is likely to be met with reassurance and delay. "We trust each other. We don't need paperwork yet, let's focus on the product." Instead, the founder mentions, almost as an aside during an unrelated conversation, a story about two friends who started a company together on a handshake, grew it successfully over 3 years, and then split acrimoniously over an ambiguity in an equity understanding that neither of them had ever actually written down, a dispute that, notably, neither of them saw coming, because they trusted each other completely right up until the moment the ambiguity actually mattered. The story includes specific, concrete detail, the exact nature of the ambiguity, the year it surfaced, the fact that both friends had, independently, remembered the original verbal agreement differently from each other, in complete good faith, with neither one lying. No moral is stated. The founder simply finishes the story and moves the conversation elsewhere. Days later, the co-founder raises, unprompted, the idea of putting something in writing just to be safe, arriving, on their own, at the exact conclusion the story was constructed to produce, and experiencing it entirely as their own initiative. Try this. The next time you want someone to consider an idea they might otherwise resist if stated directly, try building a short, honest, specific story around a real or realistic situation that demonstrates the mechanism you want them to understand, rather than stating the point outright. Practice ending the story without a moral, no matter how strong the temptation to add one, and see what the listener does with the silence afterward. Key idea: arguments get evaluated, resisted, and often successfully counter-argued. Stories get absorbed, largely undefended, because the listener's evaluative machinery was never actually activated to begin with. The idea living inside a well-told story arrives at its destination without ever passing through the checkpoint that was specifically built to catch it. Chapter 12. Emotional Anchoring, Suggestion Through Feeling, Not Logic. Decision science has converged, across several decades of research from multiple independent lines of inquiry, on a finding that remains uncomfortable for anyone who thinks of themselves as a primarily rational decision maker. The large majority of human decisions are made emotionally first, and justified with logical-sounding reasoning only afterward, in a process running in the opposite direction from how most people describe their own decision-making to themselves. Some of the clearest evidence for this comes from neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to specific emotional processing regions of the brain, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. These patients, remarkably, often retain fully intact logical reasoning capacity. They can construct detailed, valid pro and con lists for a given decision as well as anyone else, yet frequently become unable to make even basic, low-stakes decisions at all, sometimes spending extraordinary amounts of time deliberating over trivial choices like which restaurant to eat at. Damasio's interpretation, developed into what he called the somatic marker hypothesis, is that these patients have lost access to the felt sense, the emotional pull toward one option over another, that ordinarily does the actual work of selecting between options that pure logical analysis alone cannot fully resolve, because pure logical analysis, absent any emotional weighting, can generate an endless, paralyzing list of considerations without ever producing a felt sense of which one actually matters most. Why this means suggestion should target feeling, not just facts. This finding reframes what the deepest, most durable layer of suggestion actually has to operate on. It doesn't operate on facts at all. At its core, it operates on feeling, specifically by attaching a particular emotional state to a specific idea, so that later, at the actual moment of deciding, the feeling resurfaces first, ahead of any explicit reasoning, and the reasoning that follows gets constructed, often quite elaborately and sincerely, to justify a conclusion the feeling had already, silently, reached. This is why a well-told story that ends in a felt sense of relief, see Chapter 11, makes quit the difficult job feel obviously, unmistakably true before any spreadsheet comparing salaries or benefits has even been opened. It's part of why a product demonstration built around delight, the specific felt experience of a feature working smoothly and pleasingly, consistently outsells a product presentation built around a dense list of technical specifications, even among buyers who sincerely believe themselves to be highly rational, spec-driven decision makers. And it's part of why the simple phrase "just imagine how it would feel" reliably does more persuasive work, word for word, than an equivalent list of concrete, factual benefits, because it invites the listener to generate the actual felt experience internally, rather than merely process a description of it. How pairing works, mechanically. Practically, emotional anchoring works through a process of pairing, introducing the idea you want remembered in close temporal proximity to a genuinely, actively evoked feeling, not merely a described feeling, which is a meaningfully weaker version of the technique. Describing relief in words is comparatively weak as a suggestion tool. Actually walking someone through a small, real, currently occurring moment of relief, even a minor one, connected to some entirely different topic, while the idea you actually care about is present nearby in the conversation, is considerably stronger, because the emotional state doing the anchoring work is genuinely active in the listener's nervous system at the moment the pairing occurs, not merely referenced abstractly. This connects to a well-established principle in learning and memory research called state-dependent memory in association. Information encoded while a particular emotional or physiological state is active becomes linked, in memory, to that state, and tends to resurface together with it later. If the felt sense of relief is genuinely active in the room when an idea is introduced, that idea becomes woven into the same associative network as the feeling itself, and the next time something reactivates relief, even something unrelated, the idea tends to resurface alongside it, seemingly out of nowhere, feeling like a spontaneous realization rather than the deliberately anchored association it actually is. An important caution about manufactured feeling. It's worth being unusually direct about the darker mirror image of this technique, because it's extremely common and extremely damaging when used badly. Emotional anchoring is also the mechanism most easily and most frequently weaponized through manufactured urgency and manufactured fear. This offer expires in 10 minutes. Manufactures artificial urgency, a form of manufactured anxiety, and anchors a purchasing decision to that anxiety rather than to any genuine relief or considered benefit. Certain political and media rhetoric manufactures fear deliberately and repeatedly, anchoring specific beliefs or specific candidates to a felt sense of danger that may have little basis in the actual, careful facts of a situation, precisely because fear reliably narrows deliberation and speeds up decision-making in ways that benefit whoever is doing the anchoring. The underlying mechanism in both the healthy and the abusive version is genuinely identical. Pair an idea with an active feeling, and the idea inherits the feeling's motivational pull. The ethics of the two cases diverge entirely and completely based on a single question: is the emotion being paired with the idea authentic to the actual situation, earned honestly by real circumstances, or is it artificially, deliberately manufactured specifically in order to bypass the listener's own considered judgment about whether the feeling is actually warranted? A genuine deadline, honestly disclosed, that happens to create real urgency is different in kind, not just in degree, from a fake countdown timer engineered purely to manufacture false urgency where none actually exists. Try this. Think of a genuine, honest benefit you'd like to help someone else see clearly, not something you're trying to sell them, but something you sincerely believe would help them. Rather than listing the reasons it's a good idea, think about which specific, authentic feeling is actually associated with that benefit: relief, excitement, pride, calm, and consider a real, honest way to let that feeling become genuinely present in the conversation before or alongside the idea itself, rather than simply describing the feeling in the abstract. Key idea: people rarely remember your argument nearly as clearly, or for nearly as long, as they remember how they felt while they were hearing it, and it is usually the feeling, not the argument standing next to it, that actually makes the decision, with the argument arriving afterwards simply to make the decision feel justified. Chapter 13: The Slow Drip, Suggestion Through Repetition and Consistency. A single suggestion, however elegantly crafted using every technique described in the previous 12 chapters, rarely reshapes a firmly held belief on first contact. But an idea encountered repeatedly, from varied sources, spread out over time, develops something psychologists have named the illusory truth effect. Mere repeated exposure to a claim measurably increases how true that claim feels to the person hearing it, entirely independent of any actual evidence presented for it. And this is the detail that makes the effect genuinely unsettling, largely independent of whether the person consciously remembers having encountered the claim before at all. Why repetition launders rather than merely informs? This finding, first demonstrated clearly by researchers Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Tapino, and replicated many times since across different content domains, is the mechanism behind why advertising repeats a slogan or brand name far past the point where any single viewer could plausibly still need reminding what the product actually is. Repetition, in this context, doesn't primarily inform. Informing was accomplished by the first or second exposure at most. What continued repetition does instead is launder. Each new exposure to the same claim feels slightly more familiar than the last exposure did, and that rising sense of familiarity gets systematically misread, by the same source monitoring gap first described in Chapter 1, as a rising sense of credibility. The mind, unable to reliably distinguish "I've heard this a lot" from "this is well established and true," substitutes the easier judgment for the harder one, exactly the way it substitutes "is this popular?" for "is this good?" in the social proof mechanism described in Chapter 10. Troublingly, research on the illusory truth effect has found that even statements a person initially, correctly identifies as false, on first hearing, can shift toward feeling more true after repeated later exposure. Prior knowledge provides less protection against this effect than most people assume it should, because the feeling of truth and the actual, remembered knowledge of falsity are generated by partially separate cognitive systems that don't always successfully communicate with each other. Two refinements that separate effective repetition from mere nagging. Two specific refinements make deliberate repetition function as genuine suggestion rather than as mere nagging, and nagging, importantly, tends to produce active resistance and irritation rather than the intended acceptance, because repeated, identical, insistent pressure from a single recognizable source triggers exactly the kind of visible source defensiveness that effective suggestion techniques are specifically designed to avoid. Vary the surface, keep the core. The identical underlying idea, delivered once through a personal story, once through a statistic mentioned in passing, once through a quiet aside during an unrelated conversation, and once through a question rather than a statement, feels to the listener like independent corroboration arriving from multiple separate directions, even though, examined carefully, it is the same single suggestion recurring in different clothing each time. A single message repeated identically, word for word, triggers what researchers call psychological reactance, a defensive pushback against a perceived attempt at pressure, fairly quickly, often within just 2 or 3 repetitions. The same underlying message, varied in surface form each time it recurs, largely avoids triggering that same defensive reactance, because each instance genuinely doesn't feel, on its surface, like a repetition of the previous one, even as it accomplishes the identical underlying reinforcement. Spacing beats massing. An idea revisited briefly across several genuinely separate conversations, spaced days or weeks apart, embeds into belief more durably, according to a large body of research on spaced repetition in learning and memory, than the identical total amount of exposure compressed into one single, long, concentrated conversation. Each fresh encounter, arriving after enough time has passed for the previous encounter to have faded somewhat from immediate memory, partially resembles an independent discovery or independent confirmation, rather than a continuation of pressure the listener is already aware of and possibly already resisting. This is, incidentally, also why cramming for an exam produces weaker long-term retention than the identical study time spread out across multiple separate sessions. The underlying memory mechanism is the same one being exploited, deliberately or not, whenever an idea is suggested repeatedly over time. The consistency principle, and why it's the more powerful engine. There's also a well-studied consistency principle worth naming explicitly here, because in practice it does more of the actual reinforcing work than direct repetition by the suggester does. Once someone has voiced even a small, low-stakes agreement with an idea, even something as minor as saying "yeah, that's a fair point" in an offhand way during a casual conversation, they experience genuine, measurable psychological pressure, documented extensively in research on commitment and consistency by Robert Cialdini and others, to remain consistent with that earlier statement in future decisions and statements that touch on the same topic. Human beings have a strong, generally unconscious drive to see themselves, and be seen by others, as consistent over time, and even small verbal commitments activate that drive. This means the single most effective use of repetition, in practice, isn't repeating your own claim over and over across multiple conversations at all, it's creating small, low-pressure opportunities, spaced out over time, for the other person to restate a version of the idea in their own words, at each opportunity, so that the consistency principle does the actual, durable reinforcing work, rather than your own persistence doing it. Every time someone hears themselves say a version of an idea out loud, even briefly, they've made a small commitment to it that their own mind will now work, quietly and automatically, to keep consistent, which is a far stronger, far less resented form of reinforcement than hearing the same claim repeated back to them by you, again, for the 4th time. Try this. Identify an idea you'd genuinely like a friend or colleague to consider over time, not urgently, not through pressure, just something you believe would serve them well. Rather than mentioning it directly and repeatedly yourself, look for 3 separate, low-pressure opportunities, spread across different conversations over the coming weeks, to ask a brief, genuine question that invites them to voice any small piece of the idea in their own words. Notice how differently this feels, for both of you, compared to simply repeating your own point to them 3 times. Key idea: the mind doesn't ask, "Is this actually true?" nearly as often, or nearly as carefully, as it asks the far easier question, "Have I encountered something like this before?" And it reliably, systematically mistakes a confident answer to the second, easier question for a confident answer to the first, harder one. Chapter 14, The Line, where suggestion ends and manipulation begins. Every single technique described in this book so far is ethically neutral when considered in isolation, in exactly the same sense that a scalpel and a knife used as a weapon can be, physically, the identical object. A surgeon's scalpel and a weapon used to threaten someone can share a manufacturer, a blade shape, and a price point. What determines which one you are actually holding, in any given moment, is never the steel itself, it is the intent behind the hand wielding it, and, closely related, whether the other person would give their genuine, informed consent to the interaction taking place if they could see it fully and clearly, from the outside, exactly as it is. This chapter exists because a book that carefully teaches 15 chapters of psychological technique and stops there, without addressing this directly and at length, would be incomplete in a way that matters. I want to give you something more useful than a vague warning to use this responsibly. I want to give you an actual, working test you can apply, in real time, to your own conduct. A 3-question working test. Here is a working test, built from 3 specific questions, worth genuinely applying, not rhetorically, but actually, deliberately, before the conversation, before using any technique from this book on a real person, in a real situation that actually matters to either of you. Would they thank you for it, later, if they came to understand exactly how it worked? This is the single most useful question in the entire test, because it cuts through rationalization faster than almost any other framing. A good coach who used Socratic questioning, as described in Chapter 4, to help a client see their own avoidance pattern clearly for the first time will typically, when the client eventually understands the technique itself, be thanked for it, because the destination the technique led to genuinely serve the client's own interests, and the client recognizes this once they see the full picture. A con artist whose use of embedded suggestion and manufactured urgency, as described in chapters 11 and 12, is eventually exposed to the person it was used on will not be thanked, under any circumstances, because the destination served the manipulator specifically at the target's direct expense, and the target, seeing the mechanism clearly, correctly recognizes themselves as having been used rather than helped. Does the idea being suggested serve the other person's genuine, considered interest, or does it primarily serve yours, at their expense? Suggestion that helps someone arrive more quickly, and with less unnecessary friction, at a conclusion that is genuinely good for them, a conclusion they might well have reached on their own, eventually, through slower means, sits much closer to teaching, coaching, or good parenting than to manipulation, even when it uses every technique in this book aggressively and skillfully. Suggestion that installs a want or a belief that primarily serves the suggester, while actively disguising the fact that the want originated with the suggester rather than with the target, is manipulation, full stop, regardless of how gently, skillfully, or pleasantly it was delivered, and regardless of how sincerely the manipulator has convinced themselves otherwise. Would you be genuinely comfortable if the other person knew, in real time, exactly what you were doing? This is the sharpest of the 3 questions, because it strips away nearly every convenient rationalization a person might otherwise construct for themselves. Techniques used in good faith mostly survive full disclosure remarkably well. A skilled therapist can often say to a client, quite openly, "I'm going to ask you a sequence of questions now, to help you find your own answer to this rather than me just telling you what I think," and the technique continues to work perfectly well even after being named directly, because the client genuinely wants the outcome the technique is aimed at, and disclosure costs the therapist nothing except perhaps a small amount of mystique. Techniques used in bad faith almost never survive disclosure intact, because their entire effectiveness depends specifically on the target remaining unaware that suggestion is occurring at all. Announce a manufactured urgency deadline is manufactured, and the urgency, along with the sale it was manufacturing, evaporates instantly. A necessary clarification about disclosure. None of this means every use of suggestion needs to be announced aloud, in the moment, in order to remain ethical. That would be an overcorrection, and it isn't actually what the test above requires if you read it carefully. Plenty of ethical, beneficial influence, including a great deal of good parenting, good therapy, good teaching, and good leadership, genuinely works better without a running, self-conscious commentary on the technique being used at every step. Announcing every technique in real time would often make the interaction stilted, self-conscious, and less useful to the person on the receiving end, not more honest in any meaningful sense. The actual test isn't, did you announce this out loud? The real test is, would the announcement, if you made it, have destroyed anything except your own leverage or your own convenience? If the only thing disclosure would cost you is the specific element of surprise, the way telling a friend, I'm about to ask you some questions to help you think this through, costs a good conversation almost nothing, you are very likely still standing on the right side of the line. If disclosure would cost you the entire relationship, the entire sale, or the entire outcome, because the other person would immediately and correctly walk away the moment they understood what was actually happening, you have already crossed it, whatever story you're currently telling yourself about your own intentions. A brief, honest note on self-deception. It's worth acknowledging directly that almost nobody who uses these techniques manipulatively experiences themselves, in the moment, as a manipulator. Manipulation, in ordinary human practice, is rarely committed by people who think of themselves as villains. It's far more often committed by people who have quietly, gradually convinced themselves that the ends justify the means, that the other person needs to be moved toward a conclusion for their own good, or that the specific technique being used doesn't really count as manipulation because it feels gentle, indirect, or well-intentioned in the moment. This is precisely why the three-question test above is structured the way it is, not as a single, easily rationalized gut check, but as three separate, specific questions, asked in advance rather than in comfortable hindsight, each one closing off a different, common avenue of self-deception. Try this. Before your next use of any technique from this book in a conversation that genuinely matters, pause and actually run all three questions, in order, honestly, before you begin, not as a formality, but as a real check. If any one of the three answers gives you pause, treat that pause as real information, not as an obstacle to be reasoned past. Key idea: the techniques described across this entire book do not, themselves, carry any ethics at all. You do. Every previous chapter handed you a tool. This chapter is the only one that decides, in the end, what gets built with them, and that decision is remade, every single time, by you, in each specific conversation, not settled once and for all by having read this chapter. Chapter 15. Becoming the Architect, Applying Suggestion in Real Life. Understanding a mechanism and actually using it well, in real conversations with real consequences, are two genuinely different skills, and the gap between them is closed only through deliberate, patient, small-scale practice, not by attempting to orchestrate some elaborate, high-stakes masterclass negotiation as your very first real-world attempt at any of this. Here is a practical path through everything this book has covered, structured deliberately as a progression to actually work through over time, rather than as a simple checklist to skim and set aside. Start with defense, not offense. For the first 2 weeks after finishing this book, resist the temptation to try suggesting anything to anyone at all. Instead, spend that time simply noticing suggestion being used on you, in advertising, in the news, in casual conversations with friends and coworkers, in negotiations you're party to. Name the specific technique out loud, even if only silently, inside your own head. As you notice it, that's an anchor, that's a presupposition disguised as a question, that's social proof, and I don't actually know if it's real. This single habit, noticing rather than immediately resisting or immediately using, is what actually inoculates you against unwanted influence over the following months and years. You genuinely cannot defend yourself against a mechanism you're unable to see operating in real time, and 2 weeks of dedicated noticing will sharpen that perception more than months of passive reading would. Practice one technique at a time, deliberately, in low-stakes settings. Pick presupposition first, from Chapter 4's cousin technique described in the opening of the techniques section, since it's genuinely the simplest to practice safely. For 1 full week, replace ordinary yes or no questions with which questions in entirely ordinary, low-stakes conversations. Should we get coffee? Becomes should we get coffee here, or try the place around the corner? Notice, concretely, how much less friction and hesitation the which question tends to produce in casual daily life, before moving on to practicing a second technique the following week, and so on, working through the book's techniques one at a time rather than attempting to combine several at once before any single one feels natural. Pair every technique with genuine, verifiable care for the other person's actual interest. The strongest, most durable version of every single method described in this book requires that you actually, sincerely want a good outcome for the other person specifically, not merely a compliant or convenient outcome for yourself. This is not a moral nicety loosely bolted onto otherwise neutral technique as an afterthought. It is functionally, practically necessary for the techniques to keep working over time, because people are considerably better than they typically realize at detecting insincerity beneath even quite skillful language and quite well-executed technique. And detected insincerity collapses the rapport and trust described in Chapter 6 far faster than any single technique, however well executed, can rebuild it afterward. Suggestion used repeatedly and skillfully in service of someone else's genuine benefit tends to deepen a relationship over time. The identical techniques used repeatedly in service of your own convenience at their expense tend, eventually, usually sooner than expected, to be found out. Use the 3-question test from Chapter 14 before the conversation, not after it. The natural, very human temptation with any genuinely powerful tool is to use it first, in the moment, and evaluate the ethics of having used it only afterward, in comfortable, self-serving hindsight, once the outcome is already secured. Build the specific habit, deliberately, of running the 3-question test. Would they thank me for this once they understood it? Does this genuinely serve their interest rather than mainly mine? Would I be comfortable if they knew exactly what I was doing right now, before the conversation that actually matters, as a genuine gate you have to pass through, rather than as a retrospective justification you construct comfortably after the fact, once the outcome you wanted has already been secured and there's less genuine incentive left to answer honestly. Notice which techniques come naturally to you, and which ones require more deliberate effort. Most people, on working through this book carefully, find that certain techniques, mimicry and rapport building, perhaps, or storytelling, or careful framing, already come reasonably naturally to them, often because they picked up some version of the underlying skill informally, long before encountering this book, through simple life experience, good role models, or natural temperament. Other techniques, Socratic restraint, in particular, which asks you to sit with genuine, uncomfortable silence rather than filling it, tends to be difficult for almost everyone at first, regardless of natural temperament, because the discipline it requires runs directly against the nearly universal human impulse to fill silence and to finish other people's sentences for them. Knowing honestly which techniques you find genuinely difficult is more useful, over the long run, than knowing which ones you find easy, because the difficult ones are usually the ones that will most reward deliberate practice. Remember, throughout all of this, that the actual goal was never control. The techniques in this book, used well, do not hand you power over other people's decisions in any meaningful, lasting sense. Attempts to use them that way tend to be discovered, resented, and to permanently damage the very rapport and trust the techniques depend on for continued effectiveness. What these techniques actually give you, used well and used honestly, is the ability to remove unnecessary friction between another person and a conclusion that was, in an important sense, already true, already genuinely available to them, and already theirs to reach on their own, just buried, in practice, under noise, hesitation, unhelpful framing, or a simple, common inability to fully articulate something they already sensed but hadn't yet found the words or the courage for. The best, most durable use of suggestion, over a lifetime of practicing it, does not install a new idea inside someone else's head that wasn't there before. It clears an honest, respectful path to the good idea that was already quietly forming there on its own, and helps that person arrive at it faster, and with more genuine confidence, than they would likely have managed entirely alone. That, in the end, across all 15 chapters, is the actual craft this book has been describing. Not making an idea feel like it belongs to someone else. Helping the genuinely good ones actually, truly become theirs, faster, and with less unnecessary suffering along the way than the slow, solitary route would have required. Try this, a closing exercise. Choose one real, upcoming conversation in your life over the next month, something that genuinely matters to you and to someone you care about. Before that conversation, write out, briefly, which 2 or 3 techniques from this book might honestly help the other person arrive at real clarity faster. Run the 3-question test from chapter 14 against your own plan, and only then have the conversation. Afterward, write a few honest sentences about what you notice, what worked, what felt forced, and whether the other person's sense of ownership over whatever was decided felt genuine to you. This single exercise, done honestly once, will teach you more about the real, practical difference between technique and manipulation than any amount of further reading could. A closing note. If you take away only one thing from everything covered across these 15 chapters, take this: suggestion is not some rare, exotic tool reserved only for advertisers, hypnotherapists, and skilled negotiators operating in special, high-stakes circumstances far removed from ordinary life. It is the water every single conversation you have ever had, or will ever have, actually swims in, present, constantly, whether or not anyone in the room has ever read a page about it. The only real, meaningful choice genuinely available to you, once you've reached the end of this book, is whether you go on swimming in that water unconsciously, shaped, quietly and continuously, by every suggestion that happens to reach you from advertisers, from institutions, from well-meaning and not so well-meaning people in your own life, or whether you become someone who can finally, actually see the current moving beneath the surface of ordinary conversation, and choose, deliberately, and with real care for the people around you, which direction you're willing to help it flow.